Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a 1-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Football, the show that looks at the money behind the beautiful game with me, Kevin Day, and Liverpool University's Kieran Maguire. Kieran, normally I would, knowing that you weren't tickety-boo last time we spoke because you had a touch of the old norovirus, I would normally ask how you are. But as that was literally 30 minutes ago that you told me because we just recorded Thursday's one, I don't think there's been any significant improvement. Although you've stayed in the room for quite some time, Kieran, so that's a good sign.
I'm always half full rather than half empty. Although with norovirus, I think it's fair to say you're probably 9/10 empty, to put it mildly.
It's Friday, Kieran, and normally I'd be introducing an interview. This is not really an interview; it's more a Q&A. Because Nick DeMarco, KC, who's the country's leading sports barrister, I think we can all agree, especially when he's been kind enough to come on the show for nothing. The least we can say is this country's leading sports barrister. He agreed to answer questions from you and I, Kieran, but also from our listeners. And it was... I sometimes worry about saying what a brilliant interview it was in case I upset some of the other people who've just done very good interviews. But this one was not an interview. So I can say it was brilliant without worrying upsetting anybody else. So this is what Nick had to say about many, many subjects. Nick, thank you so much for joining us again. It's always a pleasure to have you on. Our listeners are always very excited as well to try and crowbar some free legal advice out of you by asking questions in somebody else's name. Before we get on to those readers' questions, I've got one for you myself, and it's a slightly existential one, and it's also counterintuitive considering we're interviewing you and 50,000 people will hear it. I'm sure the game of football has always had lawyers involved. I imagine back in medieval times with those 100-a-side games between villages, there would have been a lawyer in the background negotiating the tapestry rights for individual players. But would you rather football fans weren't talking about law and lawyers as much as they are these days? Would you rather be operating in the background rather than the high profile that Lords has at the moment in football?
Well, yes and no. It depends which hat I'm wearing, I think, Kevin. First of all, thank you for having me on again. And of course, I wouldn't be on and you wouldn't have this podcast if we didn't have the type of issues we have. So yep. In that sense, if we didn't have them, life may not be as interesting. But if I'm wearing my football fan hat and looking at football from a fan's perspective, as I often do, because I was a fan a long time before I was a lawyer and still am, unfortunately, a fan, then I would say yes. And in particular, one thing I still feel, even as a lawyer, is that things as important as promotion and relegation or qualification for some fantastic tournament that can transform the lives of the club and its fans, those ought to be determined on the pitch, not behind closed doors with a load of lawyers and accountants arguing about things that most people never get to really understand, because it will take the excitement out of the game if they're controlled or determined by people like us doing that. So, of course, we have an important role to play in the sport, but there has to be a proper balance.
Let's start with a question. You mentioned relegation. This is a catch-up from our questions pod, which went out this week, which we tried to answer, but then we thought, hang on a second, we've got an expert coming on. He'll be able to tell us this. And it comes from David Morn. And David's question is a simple one. If a player has a clause in his contract that means if a club is relegated, his salary goes down. If the club is relegated, though, entirely due to a points deduction caused by their own misdemeanour, i.e. completely outside the control of the player, would that player's relegation clause still apply?
Well, I'm not going to answer the first question with the words, it depends. Because by not doing so, I shall rule myself out as being one of your secret lawyers. Um, it, of course, if I mean, it's a case I've thought about before, in fact, in relation to various things that have happened or may happen in the future. And if the breach by the club is some kind of fundamental breach of, for example, its duties of good faith under the Premier League rules, then I think an argument can be made that a player of that club who suffers, whether it's as a result of a relegation clause or it might be their value reduces. Let's say the club is relegated as a result of a penalty because of that breach, and that affects the transfer value of players. I can conceive there being a claim brought by players that they are suffering as a result of the club's breach. Now, it's not a claim that's been done before. It would be a novel new one, but so many of the things we're doing in sport are. So I think it is something that could occur in the future.
Talking of novel new ones, I'm very glad that we're recording this close enough to yesterday's news that our listeners won't have had a chance to send us 25 questions about the legal aspects of a referee being suspended for a late night rant about a football manager. So that's one for another pod, luckily. Let's ask you about the topical subject that's exercising the minds of our listeners most, and that's the regulator. And I've got two questions for you. One's very general, one's very specific. And the first question comes from James Audley, who says quite simply, as a sports KC and having been involved in a number of high-profile cases, how would you set up the independent regulator and what powers would you give them?
Well, I'm not going to dissent an enormous amount from what's already been proposed by those who've looked at this very carefully. I think the idea of an independent regulator is a good one, as an idea at least. I think the way it's suggested to be set up with some statutory underpinning is important and gives it greater powers than it would have otherwise, in particular in a world where generally money talks, and the Premier League and other leagues have perhaps been seen to be able to push around the FA so much that the FA, which is supposed to be our football regulator, doesn't really regulate. So I think the general framework is right, but the two main, if you like, either criticisms or words of warnings I would have are these. Firstly, the regulator is supposed to be there in large part to encourage financial sustainability. That's what they say. And that's a good thing, generally speaking. But they also say they will not interfere with the league's financial fair play rules, or the PSR rules as they're now called. I think that's a mistake, because those rules act, firstly, they are justified on the basis of financial sustainability. Whether they actually do so or not, I question. But secondly, those rules, one of the real problems with them, one of the real controversies, one of the main reasons I think we need an independent regulator is the problem with self-regulation is clubs vote for their immediate financial self-interests. And that means those rules are at least perceived to be, and I'm not going to get involved in the argument, but they're often perceived to be there to hold back competitor clubs and uphold the status quo. And that doesn't help competitive balance. And I've seen no real evidence that those rules have helped financial sustainability either over the past 10 years. So I think if the regulator is serious about financial sustainability and wants to encourage competitive balance, it needs to look at and interfere with those financial rules. So that's the one point. And very quickly, on the other hand, I think the regulator needs to be careful not to interfere too much, because whatever people complain about, the Premier League is the most successful football competition in the world, economically and in terms of its excitement, its the number of viewers around the world, and so on. And the Premier League has done an extremely good job of building that brand and selling its commercial rights and so on, that I just don't think a government civil servants are equipped to do or should be doing. So they need to allow the leagues to develop commercially, develop their product. But where they are regulating in the financial sphere, they need to do it comprehensively, in my view.
The specific question then arises from an interview we did last week with Mark Ives, General Manager of the National League, who said that contrary to public opinion, that the National League were actually in favour of the regulator, but he had two very big caveats, both to do with the same subject. First of all, he said he thought the job of the regulator would be hampered in the first 2 or 3 seasons by a number of legal challenges by individual clubs against rulings made by the regulator. And he feared that the cost of defending those legal challenges would fall on lower league clubs like his. And he thought that was unfair. First of all, would you agree with him that you would expect clubs to challenge regulatory decisions? And who would foot the bill if the league's, the regulator was then defending those challenges?
Yeah, well, I heard your interview with Mark, and Mark and I go back many years. I've been against him in many cases. We've had so many tussles, but I think we've always remained on good terms. And I agree with nearly everything he said on this subject. I'm not sure whether there will be many challenges in the first few years, but there will inevitably be legal challenges to the regulator by clubs who have been sanctioned by the regulator, obviously, but also, what you see a lot more of these days, and it causes a lot of problems to the Premier League and the EFL, is clubs complaining that some other club hasn't been punished for something. And then you can challenge the regulator for not doing something, because as a public body, you can do so. You say, well, it's your duty to do this. Why haven't you done this? And I've even speculated about the position of fans groups who are, in public law terms, interested parties, interested in the outcome of cases or in the regulator's duties, perhaps being able to bring judicial reviews against the regulator for failing to act or for acting in a certain way. So I think there's a lot of legal challenges that may emerge. And I do worry about the costs, because what we've seen recently is costs going through the roof in football cases. I think you discussed the Everton case where the Premier League managed to incur nearly 5 million costs for a 5-day hearing that even made my eyes water. If you have that, and you have, in particular, Premier League clubs bringing challenges, and then you think that the regulator's budget is apparently 10 million for everything, not just for legals, for everything, then you can see there's a real problem. And so I think Mark's right first to say that it's the clubs who are going to pick up the bill, but then there needs to be some proportionality, as I think Mark said. And I was trying to think of how to do that. And maybe you could have something like a kind of cost budgeting, which you have in the courts. So you might say, well, if this is a claim by a Premier League club against the regulator, and it's worth potentially £2-3 million, if each side wants to have £1 million costs and the winner loses, then that's fine. But if this is a claim that's brought by a National League club, or a National League club is involved, then the costs on both sides have to be much lower, and we're going to cap them much lower. And then you basically say that the winning party pays the other side's costs. And in terms of clubs picking up the regulator's costs, that would have to be done, to be fair, in some kind of tiered way, where the Premier League might pay 80%, the EFL 15%, the National League 5%, whatever it is. So I think that's a good thing to look at.
Is it not possible, though, Nick, to remove any of that by, when you set up the regulator, you just enshrine, you just say that the decisions are final. These cannot be appealed against, because if there is the possibility to appeal against every decision the regulator makes, then that's a road to chaos, isn't it? Is it not possible to say that, whether you agree with these or not, you have to abide by this decision?
Well, what you suggest is what every regulator would like to be the case, but where we live in a country with the rule of law and where regulators can get things wrong and can make unlawful decisions, there has to be a right to challenge that. Now, broadly speaking, the proposals of the regulator limit your right to challenge to very limited, specific, it's a high bar to challenge. But there are other areas where there could be a full merits review. So, for example, the regulator would have the power to take away someone's ability to be an owner of a football club. Now, that is a very draconian power. If you're a multimillionaire or billionaire and you own a club and you're suddenly told you have to sell your shares and you're not allowed to own it because they find you've done something, you're going to have the right to challenge that decision, even on a full merits review, as we call it, i.e. go over the facts in a court. And the regulator realizes that. So unfortunately, as with everything, or fortunately, um, people make mistakes, even the best people make mistakes, and there has to be some route to challenge these things.
As always, with all your answers, Nick, which are fantastic, of course, but they always raise other questions. If a regulator was to remove a club from an owner, could the regulator only do that for an offence that happened after the regulator was put in place, or could they look at it from an historical point of view and say we've discovered this happened 5 years ago, and therefore we are taking the club from you?
Well, that will depend on what the rules say. But if the rules say that someone is ineligible, for example, I mean, the common example for this sort of thing is someone has done, committed fraud, something very serious, dishonest, which makes them unfit to be a football owner. If the reason it didn't come up 5 years ago is because they concealed it, as most fraudsters will do, then if it comes up later, generally speaking, you can still punish them. So it will depend on the exact phrasing of rules. But if, on the other hand, they make up some new rule, like they nearly did, but I'm paraphrasing it, but didn't. If you disagree with the government's foreign policy, you can't be a club owner. If they made up some new rule like that, which they're not going to, thankfully, then obviously that could only apply prospectively.
Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a 1-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
The problem is, and we've discussed this, we will discuss this later on with one of our questions, when they're coming up with the rules, they need somebody as clever as you to come up with the rules, because otherwise in future, somebody as clever as you is going to find a reason for that rule isn't properly worded.
Well, I'm sure they will find many people as clever or cleverer than me to advise them and help them draw up the rules. The truth is, because I've occasionally advised people on drawing up rules or drawing up contracts, which is the same kind of thing. However clever you are, you can never guess everything that might happen and every eventuality, because new things happen. I mean, as you say, last night, the breaking news about the referee and so on, it's not entirely new, but I think that's an example of the type of new things that are happening in football that are going to create greater scrutiny of those areas that previously were under less scrutiny.
Yeah. That's one of those cracking stories about the referee where we're all invited by pundits to disapprove of that behaviour, when in fact we're all delighted to learn of that sort of story when a referee's involved, behaving the way we do after games. Of course we disapprove. It's shameful behaviour. It shouldn't be allowed. But on the other hand, make sure he referees the next Liverpool game available, is like I say. Ollie Cantrell has a question which is about something I know is dear to your heart and to Kieran's, and that's transparency. And Ollie Cantrell says, you are an outspoken advocate for ensuring that disputes involving football are held in the open rather than behind closed-door arbitrations. But does the recent Manchester City Premier League arbitration not illustrate the problem with this approach? Within minutes of the publication of the award, both the Premier League and Man City were claiming victory, with partisan fans and journalists amplifying these misleading, these simple conclusions across social media. So the public confusion regarding the outcome does not appear to me to be beneficial, says Ollie. So surely maintaining private closed-door disputes prevents the spread of misleading narratives about the outcome of such disputes. As a counter to that, though, we have had many questions about Man City, simply asking why can't we even know the charges against Manchester City for the next thing? So we've had this outcome, which most of us didn't even know was happening, and now we've got another one coming along, and we don't know what the details are. So, which is the best approach? Complete and open transparency, or Ollie's suggestion of totally behind closed doors?
Complete and open transparency, subject to exceptions where necessary. Because Ollie's example is a good one. One of the reasons I think there was so much debate and disagreement about the decision in Manchester City is because until that decision was published, this is the APT arbitration, until the decision in that case was published, nobody knew what the arguments were, how those arguments were received by the tribunal, how important each party pressed particular arguments. You know, I might have 6 arguments in a skeleton argument when I go to court, but if you actually see me in court, I'm only interested in argument number 2. The others are there as backups, but I'm really pressing number 2. Nobody knows which arguments were important. And suddenly you have a decision, that's the first thing you've got, and everybody's interpreting it and trying to say who won and who didn't win. So if there had been a public hearing, if it had been transparent, given how high profile it was, all these things would have been reported on before. And so I expect there would have been less difference and confusion about the results. So that's my first point. My second point is, even if I'm wrong on my first point, then so what? Does that mean that we get rid of public debate because people disagree? Of course not. Public debate's a good thing. Disagreement often shines light on things. In fact, the fact that, articles in the Times and other newspapers dissect a complicated decision of competition law has probably encouraged more people to read, understand, think about, and discuss these things. All of that's a good thing. The third point is that the decision would have had to have been published anyway. I'm not sure if Ollie's saying the decision shouldn't be published. It surely would have had to have been published because it led to a finding that the Premier League's central rules are unlawful, which means the Premier League has to tell the clubs that. And by the way, you can't tell the clubs anything without it leaking to the press. The Premier League has to tell the clubs that. The clubs have to vote to try and change the rules, or something has to happen because those rules are unlawful. So you could have never kept the decision secret. And my general argument is, when you have to publish the decision, which is usually the case in these sorts of cases for the reasons I've just explained, then there's no real justification for the hearing being in private. If the whole thing was in private, then sure. So that's my answer to Ollie's question. In relation to the other case, the ongoing disciplinary case against Manchester City, where they're being charged, obviously, again, they will have to publish the decision. You asked about, one of your questioners asked about, we're not allowed to know the charges. I think we can know the charges. If you look at the Premier League website, they've put out way back in 2023 now, whenever it was when they brought these charges, they put out a press statement and they categorize the charges into 5 general heads. Things like, not giving accurate financial information, or not giving accurate information about player payments or manager payment. They have these different headings, and then under each heading, they say, this is in relation to seasons, and they'll put 9 seasons, and then they'll say, each season's in relation to 8 different rules. And I haven't got a spreadsheet like Kieran, but when I looked at this, I worked out that you could work out the 150 whatever it is charges from those, and it wouldn't actually be any more interesting, certainly, or informative to say in breach of rule P79 of the 1924 rule or whatever. So I think we do know the gist of the charges. What we don't know, and what we would know if there was a public hearing, is what the evidence is in support of those charges, what the arguments are. We don't know any of that. And again, we'll probably be in a similar situation that when the final results published, both sides will claim victory, and no one will really know what happened.
While we're talking about Manchester City, Nick, I know it's difficult for you to comment on specific cases, but were you surprised by the outcome of the Mendy tribunal?
Well, I certainly can't comment directly on that, given that my own involvement in it. What I can say about that case is it's a very interesting case, and I think even though not to do any disservice to the employment tribunal, it's what's called a first instance decision in the tribunal, even though it's a first instance decision and not a sort of appeal decision. It's the first time this difficult issue has been tested by English courts. And because it was actually we brought the claim in the tribunal, it was my idea to bring it there for various reasons. It was a public hearing. So in this particular case, the press logged in and listened to it and were able to report on the arguments. And you have a public decision. And it's going to be of great interest to football clubs. I've been on both sides of this argument. I've acted for a club who tried to dismiss a player alleged to have raped somebody before the trial took place, and the club lost, and that was all in private arbitration. And we can't talk about the parties or why the club lost, but I can see all the arguments, as one often can. But it's a very interesting position, in particular with things like FA safeguarding, which is very, very strict. The player is banned on a precautionary measure, not because they've been found to have done something wrong, but the FA says you can't play football until the trial, until you're acquitted. Then a player's got a contract for 2 years. He hasn't actually necessarily done anything wrong, because you're innocent till proven guilty. What can the club do? Well, in this case, the club just decided not to pay him, which was an enormous risk. And I think the tribunal's decision in that sense is to be welcomed. But you can see the difficulty because of the nature of football contracts, which are very hard to terminate, except in exceptional circumstances, and of course the amount of money at stake.
So, with my ex-human resources hat on, and as one of the safeguarding leads on Palace for Life, I've applaud. I don't think Man City had any choice but to suspend him initially. I think that's what every other organisation would have done anyway, football or not football. It's the fact that they didn't pay him, like you said. They gambled on the outcome they basically prejudged it themselves, didn't they? Which was the mistake.
Well, Kevin, they were, of course, entitled to suspend him. And you've hit the nail on the head. It's that they had no contractual right to suspend him without pay. Some employment relationships have that contractual right in certain circumstances, but they had no contractual right to suspend him without pay. So the only way they could do that is by arguing that he was not able to work as a result of his own conduct. And then you get into this argument about whether it's your own conduct to have been banned from playing football because of an allegation that turns out to have been rejected, which is where it becomes very difficult for the club.
This is going to sound slightly unprofessional, Nick, but this next question I can only describe as being from Bloke in Pub. Because he asked me after the Palace game on Saturday, and I was so cross by the performance, I didn't bother to ask him what his name was, but he knew that you were coming on. But his question was, if clubs are able to avoid points deductions because of what he described as clever lawyers, is there any point in having FFP regulations in the first place?
Yes. Well, one could say back to him in the pub next time you see him, if clever lawyers are able to get people off when they're charged with a criminal offence, should we just have no law at all and complete anarchy?
Yeah.
And see what he says to that. Everyone deserves a lawyer if they're charged with something, because they might not be guilty. It's again going back to the presumption of innocence that we have. And I'm not sure whether your friend in the pub thinks you should only have the right to a stupid lawyer and not a clever lawyer. But even in asking that, but then also, how do you distinguish between a stupid lawyer and a clever lawyer? And I don't make that point facetiously. I make it because most people might regard someone as a clever lawyer because they've won a case, but actually, the lawyer, I don't overestimate our own role in this. However clever the lawyer is, if the case is complete pants and your client is hated by everybody and the law's against you, you're overwhelmingly likely to lose that case, however clever you are. And you could be the world's most stupid lawyer. And although you might manage to mess up a case, if the tribunal's half sensible, you will win a easy case. And it's a bit like a football manager. You could be the most brilliant football manager, but if the players are all crap, or they're injured, or the club doesn't have any money to buy anyone, or you're playing someone in 2 leagues above you, you're probably going to lose. So we shouldn't also overestimate the role of lawyers. They are perhaps as important as managers of a football club, but no more.
I think the problem is, Nick, as we all know, we live in a country where the word clever is an insult for a lot of people, essentially, which is, we've had a government for 12 years who dislike the idea of clever people or experts. Also, the other problem, let's face it, for Palace fans is if we were comfortably mid-table, I don't think he'd have asked the question because we wouldn't have been bothered by Leicester not being deducted points. Whereas in our current plight, we would rather Leicester had been deducted points. So I think it probably came from that background. This next question is by way of a sorbet, a light, refreshing break, Nick, because the question afterwards is a complicated one. And this question comes from a young man called Kieran Maguire, who I believe is a long-term listener of the pod. And Kieran's ability to crowbar the Cure into any podcast we do is phenomenal. I sometimes think the reason he's not asked to do Cure podcasts is he would crowbar football finance questions into those. But Kieran says, you're a QPR fan alongside Robert Smith of the Cure. Do you think watching QPR all those years has impacted on Robert Smith's music? I just noticed he used impacted as a verb, Kieran. It's shameful. Had an impact upon his music.
I expect it's an essential requirement of writing such beautiful but melancholic songs and singing them to have the curse and pleasure of being a QPR fan. I in fact was not a big Cure fan until recently, because back in the 80s I was more into the hip hop and stuff like that, and the Cure used to pop up on Top of the Pops, or I like Bowie as well, so I like a lot of that stuff. But the Cure, when they were on Top of the Pops, it was more of the sort of poppy stuff that I didn't really like. But I've listened to the new album, and I was just saying to Kieran before, it's on my Spotify now. I'm listening to it regularly because it's so melancholic. I love it, and there's no poppy nonsense in it whatsoever. I highly, and it's great for a QPR fan.
I just very pleasing image of a lot of our listeners spitting their tea out when they hear Nick Marker say he was a hip hop fan and he doesn't like all this pop nonsense. Mark Boyle has the quite deep and slightly complicated question. Mark's question is around conflicts of interests, and he says that he works in corporate banking and finance, and before scope and engagement of a firm to undertake diligence work, etc., it has to be run through a series of conflict checks to ensure the partner and firm has represented, or I presume means not represented, another lender, borrower, or related party. If they have, we then either have to get explicit consent to use the firm or more likely use a different firm. Given the acute specialisation of football law from someone like yourself, Nick, how are lawyers able to represent clubs in their cases against the Premier League, given that the Premier League is a membership made up of all the clubs that may have been represented by that lawyer or firm in the past? Equally, does representation of a club to reduce a points reduction for one that could lead to the relegation of another represented in the past represent a conflict?
Well, it's a very good question from Mark, and it's actually one of the more difficult things that I find I have to navigate as someone who, I counted the other day, have this season acted for half of the Premier League clubs in one dispute or another, um, including the mighty Crystal Palace and Brighton and Hove Albion. Um, but I'd say a couple of things. First of all, and I hope this isn't going to bore your listeners, but there is a difference between barristers and solicitors. So barristers like me are all self-employed. We're not part of any firm, and I can be in the same chambers as my colleague Adam Lewis, who regularly acts for the Premier League and is on the other side to me. And that's true outside of sport in any case, because we're all self-employed. So in a sense, that makes it easier for us than a solicitor's firm, because if a solicitor's firm acts for the Premier League, it becomes very difficult for it to act against the Premier League because it's seen its confidential information as well as potentially having a conflict. But otherwise, yeah, the way it works. It's a shame it works this way because I always like acting on both sides, but basically the Premier League or the Football League or the FA will never instruct me because they see me as someone acting on the other side. So that's the bed I've been made. In other sports, I act for the British Board of Boxing or I act for the English Cricket Board. But in football, I'm acting for the clubs. That's how it has become. And so then the only conflicts I really worry about are if one of my club clients falls out with another one and starts suing them. And that's my nightmare scenario because it usually means I can't act for either club and I lose all the work, even though they're both great clients, or I have to pick a side and live with it and the other one won't speak to me again. But you do have to navigate these conflicts.
So in general, then, does this concept of the first cab off the rank, basically, the idea that barristers don't have a choice in who they represent, does that not work in football?
It does work. It generally works, but you know, if an agent comes to me and says, "I've got this player and I need to sue the club," I'll ask who the club is first, and if they say Crystal Palace or Brighton or a number of other clubs, I'll say I can't act for you in that case because I have an ongoing relationship with those clubs, which means that I'll know stuff about what goes on in those clubs and their policy, and they would be unhappy if I acted against them. If I'd only acted for another club once 2 years ago, and someone wants to sue them, then it's not a problem. And if I'm already involved in a case, I might have to just say, okay, I'll act against that club. But so generally, the cab rank rule works, but there are exceptions where you're in a position where it would cause a lot of problems if you acted against someone you regularly act for.
See, the trouble is now you've mentioned that you represented Palace in a case. When this interview comes out on Friday, my whole day is going to be taken up on WhatsApp groups with Palace fans speculating what that case may have been.
Well, it might not have been a case. We get involved in all sorts of things that don't always lead to cases.
That makes it even worse. Now we've got even less.
Not least because I've certainly acted for Palace for many years, as with Brighton, and so I'm not talking about anything necessarily that is current.
That doesn't help, Nick. That just widens the remit of the speculation. We mentioned.
Oh, you'll remember years ago, I acted for. It was one of my favourite cases for Wayne Hennessy, also on behalf of Crystal Palace, and the Nazi salute allegation, which was, and also later the Wilf Zaha and the sarcastic clapping. Two great cases for Palace players.
Yeah, we draw a veil over the Wayne Hennessy one, and especially Roy Hodgson's comment along the lines of he just really wants to learn about the Nazis. So that's not helping, Nick. Roy, it's funny. I think we were talking about this case.
Roy was a really good witness in these cases.
I imagine so. In
particular, because when they tried to cross-examine Roy, the answer they got was so long they just did not bother with the second question.
That's very funny. We mentioned associated party transactions earlier, and Ken Foster has a question elaborating on that. Ken says, bearing in mind the longevity of discussions around APT and PSR, when do you think the Premier League will ever operate on a fair and legal basis? And what will finally trigger the end of what he describes anti-competitive behaviour and baked-in historical advantages?
Is he a Newcastle fan?
It
Does he
doesn't. It doesn't. It doesn't specify.
self-identify?
I would guess. I would. Ken Foster's got a Geordie ring to it. So yeah, you would. You
Yeah,
would.
I mean, it's a good point. It's a good question. It actually, I think, goes back to your question about an independent regulator. The problem here for me is clubs making the rules rather than the rules being necessarily rational, fair, and lawful. And that can cause anti-competitive practices. Now, the example I often give is one outside the financial world. It's you remember when COVID first interrupted the football season, and we didn't know. I say interrupted now, but at the time we did not know whether the football season would be completed or not when we had the first lockdown, and there was proposals being put around for rule changes that would have meant that the clubs in the bottom three at the time would be relegated. And of course, they hadn't played all the matches. And so it would seem unfair to those three clubs that they're relegated. So other clubs were saying, no, you should have no relegation if the season is not completed. And I was involved in advising a number of the clubs on this at the time. And one of the things that struck me is if you had asked the question at the beginning of the season, so you don't know COVID's going to happen, but you say, look, imagine a terrible event will happen during the season that may terminate it halfway through. Should we have a rule that says whoever is in the bottom three is automatically relegated, even though they haven't played all their matches? Now, you can guarantee that at least 14 clubs would say, no, 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 we don't want that rule, because at least 14 clubs are all going to be thinking we could be in the bottom three at any point during the season, and we're not going to vote for Christmas as turkeys. Now, you ask the same clubs that exact same question after COVID, and you say, should the bottom three go down? Well, the bottom three aren't going to vote for it, but the other 17 may well, because they're not at risk. So you've got exactly the same rule change, and you're having completely different votes depending on the not just long term, but the immediate self interest of the clubs. And that is the problem, which leads to potential anti competitive practices of clubs making the rules themselves. And so I think the only real solution to it is having some more independence in the structuring of those types of rules, which can, some people say they are designed to, but at least they can have the effect of holding back other clubs.
On a similar note, this is a question that's come out of discussions Kieran and I have had both on the pod and off it. And we've seen clubs be sanctioned for historic breaches of cost control rules years after the deemed offence. Yet there's been no compensation claims from other clubs for lost trophies or lost promotions or lost relegations or relegations that may have happened. Is this due to the constitution of the Premier League and the Football League, or is it because the costs outweigh the benefit of any claims?
Well, don't necessarily assume there have been no compensation claims, because if there have been some, or if there are some, or if there are some that may be, then they're all going to be in this sort of closed arbitral world that I've described before. So don't necessarily assume that. And certainly if I was involved in any of them, I wouldn't be able to speak about them. But there are two routes. It's a little complicated because there are two routes to obtaining compensation here. In the Premier League and the EFL, if a disciplinary charge is brought, so for example, the Man City case that's brought by the Premier League, at the end of it, an affected party, a third party, can ask that disciplinary panel for compensation. There's a way of doing that under the Premier League rules and the Football League rules. And if you do that, you're then at the whim of the disciplinary commission. And there are advantages and disadvantages of clubs doing that, and that's one route. The other route is the club just sues another club for breach of contract. Now, this is what happened years ago in the Tevez case when Sheffield United sued West Ham. So if a club can say, you breached the PSR rules and we got relegated as a result, so therefore your breach led to our loss, they can just bring a breach of contract claim. But that breach of contract claim would be under the arbitration rules, which are slightly different from the disciplinary rules. They're again all held in private, but they're slightly different. And there's a further difference, just to complicate matters, that you can do that in the Premier League, but you can't do it in the Football League. And that's because in the Premier League, the rules say these rules constitute a contract between each club and the Premier League, and each club with each other. So if a club breaches any of the rules, potentially another club can sue it. Whereas the Football League rules essentially say the rules are just a contract between each club and the Football League. And I was involved in a case for one of the clubs who were found to have breached rules, financial fair play rules in the Championship division, resisting a claim from another club trying to sue them under this provision, and we got it chucked out because they couldn't bring breach of contract because there was no contract. But in the Premier League, there is a contract. So it's another one of these very weird disalignments between the Premier League rules and the Football League rules that exist.
You mentioned earlier, Nick, the concept of fans being interested parties. Is there anything then legally to stop? Say a club is relegated and they feel that another club should have had a bigger points deduction and therefore they were relegated. Could they encourage a fans group to take legal action or sue that club rather than do it themselves? Could fans sue another club if their club was relegated?
Under the existing rules, no,
Right,
because
okay.
they're not parties to the contract, if you like. So the Premier League contract's a contract between all Premier League clubs with each other and with the Football League. What I was talking about was the independent regulator and decisions it may make or not make. Those decisions are made by a public body because it's going to be a statutory body. And a public body is subject to what's called judicial review, which is reviewing the High Court of its decisions. And there's a lot of cases where, for example, Greenpeace or some campaigning organization might have rights as an interested party where a government department is challenged about a decision that affects the environment or whatever it is. And so that was the area I thought in the future, where you've got a proper representative fan supporters trust group, not just a few blokes in a pub, but a proper group, as a lot of these groups are. And they say, look, we are materially prejudiced by this decision or this failure to make a decision. We should have standing to challenge it in the court. I can see that as a possibility.
Okay. We have 3 more questions for you, Nick. I think they're interesting ones, but I think they're relatively straightforward, I think. The first comes from Sean Wall. And Sean says, what's the biggest piece of legislation you think is missing that would safeguard football clubs from wronging owners?
This is a difficult question because I think that what fans usually think of as a bad owner is whoever is doing badly at their particular club at a particular time. And I have to admit to having acted for some of the most colourful and controversial owners across all the 4 leagues in many cases, precisely because they have often more litigation than less colourful owners. And in nearly every occasion, I have found them to generally, with 1 or 2 exceptions, at least in their own mind, have the club's best interest at heart and spend more money than they ever got out of the club and lose money, whether wisely or unwisely. And I can't think that many of them would ever fail a test for being a good and proper owner. And that's because I think a test for being a good and proper owner essentially has to be what it already is and not much more, which is based on, for example, serious criminal offences or dishonesty and so on, which would rule people out based on what we describe as lawyers as objective standards. It's not, we don't like the look of him. It's, they have been convicted in a criminal court. That's an objective test. And those are the sort of tests that I think are right. The only thing I would change, and this is all part of overall reform of FFP rules, the only thing I would change is I think, if it's possible, look seriously at this idea of having a bond In other words, an owner comes in, I would say lift some of the silly restrictions we have, not allowing them to invest. Let them invest what they want. But what you don't want is the owner suddenly saying, "I'm fed up with this, I'm leaving." And then the club has got players on 4-year contracts that it can't afford to pay, and it goes into administration or whatever happens, as happened with Berry, for instance. And so one way to avoid that is to say to an owner, you have to put in some kind of bond to guarantee the wages that you're signing players on over the next 3-year cycle or whatever it is. Difficult to work out exactly how it works and to do, but I think, to say that and to say, okay, you'll have quite tough spending limits if you don't do that, but if you do that, then you can spend more money. I think that would encourage investment, but also would potentially protect the club from what you might call rogue owners who put money in and then walk away. So that's the one big thing I'd look at. And the other thing is as with all rules, it's all very well having them. It's how they are enforced and whether they are enforced that matters.
Our penultimate question, Nick, comes from a chap called Dan Gaster, who's a fellow writer on Have I Got News for You. He's also a Brighton fan, which makes for some lively sessions. We sometimes spend more time arguing than we do writing topical jokes. But his question is, and it came out of the conversation we were having last week, he says that if, for example, Tony Bloom wanted to buy a major stake in another club, a championship club, for example, or he did a Premier League club, could he argue that preventing him from doing so would be a restraint of trade?
Well, the things like restraint of trade, or another question, competition law, which is a sort of more European version of the same kind of thing, these things can always be justified. So there are lots of things that are potentially anti-competitive or restraints of trade, but they can be justified. And it's a question of how you justify them. And multi-club ownership is okay unless you're playing in the same competition. That's basically the way the courts internationally have looked at this. And that's for obvious reasons. The justification is integrity. You don't want the same owner owning 2 clubs within the same league, because what happens when they play each other and one needs to win and the other one doesn't? I mean, it's obvious that will undermine the integrity of the league. So you cannot have an owner owning stakes in, or majority stakes or influential stakes in 2 clubs that play in the same competition. Your question is a bit more difficult because they're talking about the championship. Problem with the championship is you still may play in the same competition. You've got the FA Cup, you've got the League Cup, and of course you're trying to get promoted, or the other club might get relegated. And what do you do then? You could just say, well, you must divest your shares within X days before it happens. But that would be the difficulty. I do wonder how it works in Formula One, because that's how it works in football. But in Formula One, it seems that nearly half the 10 competing teams own half the others or are associated with the others. It does make me wonder exactly how that works, but perhaps the integrity is at a different level in Formula One than it is in international football.
Oh, yeah, so you can trust billionaires more than you can trust millionaires. I think that's the logic. You mentioned Europe, Nick. Our last question keeps us there, and this comes from the pod, basically. It comes from a very recent discussion that we had with Maheta, who's head of the PFA, but because the European leagues and FIFPro have just launched legal action against FIFA for abuse of dominance. Could you explain exactly what abuse of dominance is, and what do you think the outcome of this case will be?
Yes, so abuse of dominance or abuse of a dominant position in the market, it's where they call it an undertaking, where a company or a body or some sort of institution has a dominant position in a particular market. So you might say, Google in the market for search engines. So where it has a dominant position, competition law makes it unlawful for it to abuse that dominant position. And you abuse it by things like price fixing or setting up measures that exclude competitors from entering the market. There's various ways you may abuse it. And in the recent Super League case that came before the European courts, brought by the Super League against UEFA and FIFA, the court found that UEFA and FIFA abuse their dominant position because, first of all, obviously FIFA and UEFA have a dominant position in the organization of and selling the commercial rights for football competitions. They have a complete monopoly position of, FIFA competitions by FIFA. So they obviously have a dominant position in that economic market, as does the Premier League have a dominant position in the market in England. So there's no question that these bodies have a dominant position. That's been established for many years. The question is, did they abuse it? In the Super League case, they found they abused it because they had what was called prior approval rules. You couldn't set up a Super League without them agreeing. Nothing wrong with them having these rules, but the rules were described as being, I think it was arbitrary, non-transparent, discriminatory. Your bloke in the pub might say they made them up as they went along. And so it was those kind of rules. And that was considered to be an abuse of a dominant position. So if they had transparent, fair, reasonable, proportionate rules, they could justify it, but they couldn't do what they did. So as I understand the FIFPro challenge, and it's not just by FIFPro, it's also being supported by the Premier League and other football league, I think the Spanish league, that challenge, one of the things they're saying is that if you're going to increase the match day calendar, as FIFA is trying to do, you have to at least consult with and have rules based on a discussion with all the other participants, such as the players and their unions and the leagues. You can't just do it yourself and impose it on everyone else. And I think that's part of their argument, that in doing so, they're abusing the dominant position. I think that's one of their main arguments. And in a way, it's a bit similar to the argument we ran for the PFA against the salary caps in League One and League Two. It's not necessarily the substance, it's that you can't introduce these things unilaterally without consulting. That's I'm simplifying it a bit,
yes,
but that seems to be the heart of this particular challenge on abuse of dominant position. Whether it will succeed or not is obviously too early to tell, but I don't know if your listeners have noted this. I have certainly noted this. There has been a sea change, a dramatic sea change in the past year, it's about a year, in the court's attitude to challenges to sports governing bodies. I've been working in this area for 20 years or so, and it is usually very easy for the governing body to say, we make the rules, these are the rules, we'll do what we like, go away, and the courts say, we're not going to interfere. That's been 99% of cases have been like that in the past 20 years. Some of these cases, like the Super League case, the Royal Antwerp case, the challenge to the FIFA agents cap in England, arbitration, the recent APT case, I could go on and on. A number of cases in the past year, 18 months, have gone the other way and said you can't just do what you want. And I think the main reason they've gone the other way is the main reason you have this podcast and the main reason I have so much work these days. Football is now a huge economic activity. It's not just a game or that can be run by the old Blue Blazer brigade behind closed doors. It is such a huge economic activity, competing with other big economic activities, that it has to obey similar standards that one sees in the law that regulate other economic activity. I think that's the reason. It's football's success as a sport that has made it come under more scrutiny, or success economically at least, that has made it come under more scrutiny of the law. And so I think it's a tendency that's likely to continue rather than fall away.
That's interesting. Nick, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you as ever. Always very interesting and very informative. And it's always the longest post-interview discussion Kieran and I have, because we'll pick up, Mark Ives will say a couple of things and we'll mention them, but with you, there's just so many notes down here that we really don't know where to start. Most importantly, we'll be speculating on where you acted for Palace and Brighton in recent years. It's been great to talk to you. Hopefully we can do it again, Nick. We'd like to make this an annual thing. And well done for implying that you're not one of our secret lawyers, by the way. I think most of our listeners will see through that. But you're part of Kieran's roster which is ever growing roster of secret people. And of course, good luck to QPR.
We need it.
I know. Well, as a Palace fan, I was about to say I look forward to seeing you at Loftus Road next season. But you have to stay. Yeah. You have to stay up as well. For
exactly.
Us
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you so much for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Cheers, Nick.
Thanks, Nick.
As I said, Kieran, we could talk through every answer he gave us and we'd be here for another hour. I think there's two things I took away from that, apart from the Roy Hodgson tribunal story, which just made me laugh very much. I mean, first of all, the importance of drafting rules properly in the first place. When it comes to talking about clever lawyers getting people off on loopholes, it's like where you want the lawyers is when you're making the rules before you even start. That's where you want the lawyers. And secondly, and it's never really occurred to me, just as you read books about, I love Shakespeare, and people will always say to you, well, Richard III doesn't know he's a baddie. Richard III thinks he's the good guy in all this, and he's doing. When Nick said that some of the people we describe as wrong-uns might be surprised to hear that, because some of them are actually doing what they think is best for their clubs. Some of them clearly aren't. But the fact that some people that we dismiss as wrong-uns might just be people who think they've come up with a clever scheme to save their club, I found that quite interesting. Obviously, Nick has probably represented some of those people, so he would say that. But there were two things. Plus, the fact, I don't know why I didn't expect a KC to be a big hip hop fan, but that came as something. It was a surprise as well. But it's fascinating. I mean, just really interesting, Kieran, wasn't it?
Yes, and what was fascinating for me was that every reply from Nick was detailed. It was proportionate. It was forensic in terms of the nature of the response, and you can see clearly why Nick is extremely popular for his clients, because you listen to me. Nick DeMarco could read out the telephone directory, and it would be a fascinating listen. He's just so intriguing in terms of the way that he structures his answers. It was a fascinating experience, and in terms of the two issues that he raised, I agree with him absolutely in respect of the first, and that applies to many things. Any rules which are brought together in haste, it's a classic case of decide in haste and repent in leisure. And you should always stress test any form of new legislation, be it from a government agency, and that's why we have reviews within Parliament and so on. And secondly, in relation to bad-uns or wrong-uns, I agree with him entirely. Many of the people that have been custodians of clubs who have gone into turmoil set out with best intentions, set out actually willing to put large amounts of money in the club, and either down to a change of circumstance or a change of viewpoint of what it's like to own a football club, which is a unique experience, have decided to withdraw. And ultimately, we all want the same thing from our owners, which is an unquestioning amount of money spent on players. And it's not quite as easy as that in practice.
Do they still have telephone directories?
I think we get something once a year.
Oh, you would do. You're in Sussex, I imagine.
Yes.
You get it on.
We still got telephone boxes.
Have you?
Yeah.
What, with telephones in them?
I think our local one's been converted into a community library.
Of course it has.
What more do you possibly expect?
It's an indication of. I know that I'm with people of my generation. If, for example, somebody comes into a room full of writers and says, "Oh, what's your name?" and we all go, "My name, J.R. Hartley." then you know you're with people the same age. While some poor little 19-year-old 0 hours contract runner just looks at you blankly and fuck, it's J.R. Hartley. There you go. Thank you to everyone who's donated to the pod via our Patreon page. If you'd like to make a small monthly contribution as well, that would be very kind of you, and it'll get you access to our chat community and our regular quizzes. And you can do that by going to patreon.com/price of football. But don't forget that big announcement I keep promising is imminent. If you have a question you'd like answered on the show, email us at questions@priceoffootball.com. And you can follow us on Twitter, X, and find us on our YouTube channel. And if you'd like to buy our book, which is out now on paperback, you can find details on our website, priceoffootball.com, or get yourself to an independent bookshop. Bye, everybody.
The price of football. The price of football.